Hi, welcome everybody. It's 6 o'clock and time to resume our 2024 book talk series. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the director of the Skyscraper Museum. Tonight's talk by Becky Nicolaides on her new book, just out for a month, on the new Suburbia, How Diversity Remade Suburban Life in Los Angeles after 1945. I'm going to quickly take a back seat, which seems appropriate for LA, and hand over to my colleague, a New York-based colleague of mine, of the museums for a long time, a board member, and Professor Owen Goodfriend.
Thank you, Carol. It's now 40 years ago that Ken Jackson published Crabgrass Frontier, and it was a book that continues to shape the way many people learn about in college and think about suburbs and suburbanization of the U.S. and the shaping of the landscape of metropolitan areas. But right away after Crabgrass Frontier came out, not only did it attract many people, including Carol and Becky and myself and others, to go to Columbia to study from Ken Jackson, but each of us ended up finding this is a really important story that he has brought out and shared with the United States, but there are elements that needed elaboration. And whether that was Andy Weiss talking about African Americans in the suburbs, or I wanted to dig more into the highway side of the story of how government paid people to move from the center to the edge. And Becky was one of the people, Becky Nicolaides, our speaker today, right away zeroed in on the idea that while the dominantly white story of the suburbs may have been the overarching narrative for much of the 20th century, it was not the whole story of the suburbs, and the upper middle class elitist country club focused suburbs, there was more to this than that. So focusing on our speaker today, Becky, she ended up doing her first book based on a dissertation that she did under Ken's supervision called My Blue Heaven. And it was really focused on the idea that there were, right from early on in the 20th century, there were some suburbs that were blue collar, not elite, not upper middle class, blue collar suburbs. And she focused on, in the LA area, in southeastern LA, some particular communities that fit that profile to paint a broader picture of this suburbanization of the United States. And that was My Blue Heaven, very well received book. Subsequently, Becky went on to collaborate with another one of the people I've already mentioned, Andy Weiss, and the two of them together did, now more than 15 years ago, the first edition of the Suburb Reader, and they did a second edition about a decade later, which collected really fantastic documents and essays, combination primary and secondary sources, all focused on understanding the complexity, messiness, and importance of the suburban story to understanding the United States. And those two things, Ken Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier and the Suburban Reader that Becky and Andy Weiss did together, are two books that continue to be widely used in classes, in colleges, in big cities, small towns, Midwest, East Coast, West Coast, all across the country. But that's not the only qualification that Becky brings to us today. She also is a co-founder of an organization called the History Studio. She lives in Los Angeles, and she practices something I think is really essential, not only coming to museum audiences like this, but also just bringing the expertise of professional historians to do our very best to keep the public narratives on track, because in a world increasingly filled with misinformation, it helps when there are Hollywood studios that want to hire historical consultants to vet the history in their scripts. And Becky's one of the people through the History Studio that do that kind of work, just keeping the history part of the Hollywood engines as on track as possible. Keep fighting the good fight on that, Becky. And she also spent almost 10 years teaching at University of California's San Diego campus. But she is now engaged in those consulting projects like the History Studio, and has spent a lot of time working on this new book that she's going to tell us about now. That is called The New Suburbia, How Diversity Remade Suburban Life in LA after 1945. Her earlier book, My Blue Heaven, had been about the mid-century period, starting in the 20s. This is very much about the post-World War II period and really comes up to the present. She and I were talking earlier about the 2010 census and how you bring the 2020 census into it. So this is a story about the diversification of the suburbs in the last couple generations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Becky. And after she's done in about 35 minutes, then I'll have some questions and we'll hopefully have a good discussion. And then, as Carol mentioned, any questions you have through the chat can be directed through her and she'll introduce those. So Becky, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Owen, for that great intro. And thank you all for dialing in. Hello from rainy LA. Kind of crazy weather we're having here. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen and then kick off my talk about the new suburbia in Los Angeles. So I think for a lot of Americans, let me just make sure here we go. I think for a lot of Americans, the image of suburbia as a place of tidy homes, green lawns, and segregated whiteness continues to have a very strong hold on our imaginations, whether to tell familiar stories, kind of pitting chocolate cities versus vanilla suburbs to illustrate urban inequality, or to tell tales of white victimhood, which Hollywood loves that trope and has pushed that image for decades, or to gain votes. You'll recall during the 2020 election, Donald Trump tried to do this by promising to protect white suburbs from affordable housing. In truth, though, the suburbs have really transitioned away from the segregated whiteness that did dominate in the 1950s and 60s, but have really begun moving towards diversity in many different ways. And this is the story that I tell in my book. This diversification really took off after 1970, and it's this phase that I call the new suburbia. So sort of the second generation of suburbs since 1945, when suburbs transformed from being white middle-class havens into this much more varied social landscape of rich, poor, Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, immigrants, the unhoused, the lavishly housed, and everybody in between. My book focuses on LA County, which is at the cutting edge of a lot of this change. But even though my book is about LA, and it is definitely a story with national significance because these trends are happening all over the United States. And I think the reason this matters is because, for one, despite the claims of some people that the suburbs are dying and, everybody's back to the city movements, in fact, quite the opposite is true. The number of suburbanites only continues to grow. As of the 2020 census, fully 54% of Americans now live in the suburbs. That is more than urban and rural areas combined. So the way I see it, suburbia is really becoming America's center of gravity. And as the suburbs are growing, they're diversifying, and that's showing up across America. It is not just an LA thing. In 2020, again, 45% of suburbanites were non-white across the country. So, what I'm seeing in LA is definitely a reflection of trends that are happening all over the country. So I've joked with friends that I maybe could have called this book Everything Everywhere All at Once, because so many processes and experiences have been playing out in the suburbs, especially in the years after 1970. So processes like immigration, globalization, economic restructuring, the rise of wealth inequality, we see factory closures, global investments, and on and on. All of these processes are happening in suburban areas. The thing about LA is these changes happened earlier, and I would argue more intensely in LA than other parts of the country, with the possible exception of New York City and Chicago, which is also seen these trends happening kind of on pace with Los Angeles. So I think for a metro area like Los Angeles, I feel like it's something of a crystal ball for what might very well be unfolding in many other regions of the country. And so history, kind of provides a great lens for looking at how this has unfolded as a sort of foreshadowing, I think, of what we're going to see happening in more and more metro areas across the US. So what I want to do tonight is share a few snapshots from my book to outline, and what I want to do is outline first, talk a little bit about how the suburbs have been changing in a broader way. And then I want to share one example of the social dynamics of that change. So this roughly follows the structure of my book. So in part one of my book, I take a metropolitan view of things. The book focuses on LA County. And the first 3 chapters of the book, I look at the evolution of LA's historic landscapes. And then I look at evolving trends in demography, housing, as well as political cultures in the suburbs on a county-wide basis. And then in part 2 of the book, I do deep dives into my 4 case study communities and doing sort of local histories of those different areas. So I want to start out with a brief overview of how the suburbs were evolving, just to kind of set the stage of what this change really was looking like. I think hands down for me, I think probably the most dramatic change was by race and ethnicity. So from 1940 to the 2000s in the United States, the suburbs flipped from being nearly all white to very racially diverse. And you can see it in this first table here, where non-white suburbanites rose from just under 10% to over 45% by 2020. In LA, it's even more pronounced. I didn't have the data for 2020 for LA, so my line there kind of cuts off in 2010. But LA is tracking much higher and more intensely than the rest of the country. So by 2010 in LA, 70% of suburbanites are non-white at that point. And if you sort of look at this from another angle, as early as 1990 in Los Angeles, a majority of each ethno-racial group in LA was living in suburban areas. So Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, a majority of all of those groups was already living in the suburbs in LA by 1990. There were also more immigrants in the suburbs. So instead of that old pattern where immigrants would first settle in the cities and then move to the suburbs, now they were settling directly in the suburbs upon arrival in the United States. So in 2010 in the United States, this was true of over half of all immigrants nationally. Over half of immigrants were making suburbia their home. And of course, in LA, it was even higher. So by 2010, 60% of immigrants were living in suburban areas. Another striking change, and I think a really important one, is that we see more and more class diversity and economic inequality in the suburbs. So rather than just being communities for the middle and upper classes, which I think is, shaped a lot of our thinking about what suburbia is, the suburbs increasingly came to house the entire class spectrum, from the ultra rich to the very poor, and including the unhoused. And suburban fortunes were very much shaped by these sort of larger forces like economic restructuring and globalization, really dictating which suburbs would prosper, which would struggle, depending on how they fit into the sort of broader political economy of the region. I think the notion of suburbia as a space of privilege was deeply complicated by this change in particular, as suburbia really began to embody wealth inequality itself, including suburban poverty. Um, this table I put together using census data, and it's basically I counted up all the suburbs that fit into each of these categories, like the number of affluent suburbs, middle class, and working class suburbs in LA County over this, from 1950 to 2010. And what we can see here is a massive number of middle class suburbs in the 50s and 60s. And then as time passed, a kind of growing polarization, the shrinking of the middle and the rise of working class as well as more affluent suburbs, really making up the whole landscape. Household composition was also changing. So in the 50s and 60s, this typical suburban household had that normative view that we hold of a suburban family, the working dad, stay-at-home mom, and 2 children. After 1970, suburban households really start to diversify. So there's more singles, divorced adults, LGBTQ residents, extended family, as well as seniors living in the suburbs. There were also more suburban moms working outside of the home in the suburbs. So even that image starts to diminish. In LA, by 2000, that older norm of the mom, the stay-at-home mom, dad, and the 2 kids, that did survive, but it survived most strongly in the wealthiest suburbs who could best afford that lifestyle, especially given like rising housing prices in the overheated housing market of Los Angeles, when those prices have been shooting upwards since 1970. And yet, even with these broader social changes, what I found is that married homeowning families tended to remain numerically dominant in many suburbs. They often held the majority voice, and their vision continued to kind of carry weight and clout, even as these social realities were changing around them. So I crunched a lot of census data for this book, but 2 data points really stood out to me, and I just want to highlight those to you. First, by 1990, non-white suburbanites outnumbered white suburbanites in LA for the first time. And then the second data point that really struck me was in 2010, non-white suburban homeowners outnumbered white suburban homeowners in LA County. That second one especially seemed really significant to me because I think it was signaling that suburban advantage was taking on new racial and ethnic hues, and that opened up all kinds of questions. I think, as we know from so much of the rich scholarship on the suburbs and suburban history, we know that for generations, whites had enjoyed suburban advantage, which gave them political clout, generational wealth, superior neighborhoods and schools and opportunities. So to me, this racial crossover begged a lot of questions about community life, political culture and allegiances, class and property relations, and what this meant in this new kind of social landscape. And I must confess, I'm a social historian at heart, and I think for me, I was especially interested in learning about the experiences of people of color who moved into the suburbs that once barred them. What was that like for them? And what happened once they got there? And then above all, did they change the suburbs or did the suburbs change them? So I followed these people of color into the suburbs, doing those deep dives into the history of Pasadena, San Marino, Southgate, and Lakewood, my 4 case study communities. I picked them because they were each representative of a suburban type in LA. And I think each of these communities really had a kind of distinct story to tell. Pasadena about the fallout of racial politics and the sort of resegregation of that community. I call that chapter White Flight Within. San Marino told a story about the impacts of Asian immigrants on a very elite and wealthy community. Southgate had a totally different trajectory. In that story, I explored the devastation of factory closure and deindustrialization, and then the arrival of Latinos right into that crisis, who faced both the problems left in the wake of deindustrialization, as well as the opportunities afforded to them in that working class suburb. And then there was Lakewood, and I'm going to be sharing the Lakewood story with you here tonight. And just quickly, though, to that question of did the new suburbanites, Black Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, did they change the suburbs or did the suburbs change them? In my book, I found no totalizing unified answer to that, as you might imagine, based on the sheer multiplicity of experiences and the local politics that I encountered in doing all of the work for this book. Rather, what I did is I used the concept of a spectrum to describe the range of ways that diverse suburbanites embraced certain political cultures. So, for example, in some suburbs, they embraced long-lived suburban habits of exclusion, especially to keep out working people and the poor and the working poor. And I found that class-based exclusion was practiced by all ethnic and race groups in suburbia. That is a theme that just continues on into this next generation. Yet in other communities, these new residents of color embraced more inclusive ideals of kind of what I call multiracial suburban ideals. I would say on balance of the suburbs that I looked at most closely, my 4 case studies, I found that first tendency towards defensive exclusion was probably the more powerful force. I think suggesting that some of suburbia's more troubling practices and habits have persisted even at the hands of diverse suburbanites and within this context of much more diversity within this entire landscape. Okay. And then there was Lakewood, which had its own distinct trajectory. So I want to share a brief slice of the Lakewood story with you to give you a sense of how I went about doing these local histories and kind of how I had the kinds of themes and strategies that I took in telling these local histories. So Lakewood actually shares an origin story similar to Levittown. It was built up rapidly in the early 1950s. From 1950 to 1953 is when the most intensive building took place. And of course, this was to meet the intense pent-up demand for housing that had been building through the Great Depression and through World War II. In Lakewood, as in Levittown, home building became a mass production enterprise, especially with FHA backing and incentives that was really promoting that kind of new way of building single-family homes. At its peak, the Lakewood Park Corporation, which was the main developer, was churning out 100 homes per day, with specialized crews moving from one home site to the next, doing one discrete task, like, pouring the concrete for the foundation, putting up the wood framing, as you can see in these photos. The homes themselves were pretty modest. They were typically from 800 to 1,100 square foot on 50-foot wide lots, and they were affordable. And, this was pretty pervasive in these post-war suburbs, often cheaper than rent in most parts of Los Angeles. So the developers of Lakewood built 17,500 homes during that first 3 years from 50 to 53. And by 1957, Lakewood's population was approaching 70,000, which I believe was double the size of New York's Levittown. Racial segregation, of course, was also part of this landscape, not very surprising. From the beginning, the developers simply refused to sell homes to Blacks, to Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Jews, or Asian Americans, which resulted in Lakewood's lily white social profile. Another notable aspect of Lakewood's origin was a plan it adopted, which they called the Lakewood Plan. The Lakewood Plan was essentially a municipal strategy that it adopted right around the time that it was incorporating in 1954. So that rather than set up their own fire department or police department or other municipal services, Lakewood decided to contract for those services with the County of Los Angeles, and that they saw that as a way of keeping tax rates low. They wanted the local control that they would get through incorporation, but they didn't want the expense of having to set up all of those municipal services like police, fire, libraries, even schools. Lakewood piggybacked onto 4 neighboring school districts. And for a lot of the residents of Lakewood who were some blue collar workers or low level white collar workers, they were wary of taxes, and there was quite a bit of support for this approach. There was some opposition, but I'd say for the most part, people in Lakewood supported this. In later years, as the town diversified, the Lakewood Plan persisted with mixed consequences, as I found in my research, especially when it came to services like policing. So policing was the first and largest service contracted by Lakewood in 1954. And what I argue in my book is that by outsourcing this service, and they basically sacrificed oversight, and this would become a widespread problem in many suburbs that contracted with the LA Sheriff's Department, which had a very mixed record on race. And it's important to note that the LA Sheriff's Department was very much a kind of suburban arm of law enforcement in LA, because it was servicing a lot of suburbs like Lakewood that had adopted this contract plan. Lakewood started it, but I think at least 30 other communities in LA County also became contract cities and would contract for services such as with the Sheriff Department. In terms of community life in Lakewood, the social homogeneity of Lakewood created a family-oriented and socially comfortable environment. In the 1950s and 60s, Lakewood residents were 98% white, predominantly native-born American, and they were members of nuclear families. And within this context, they created a very open environment of close-knit neighbors and childhood freedom, where stay-at-home moms looked after the kids who roamed freely all over Lakewood streets and parks. Lakewood's moms were the eyes on the street, keeping kids safe and fostering also a community of mutual aid, which was really strong in Lakewood. Okay, by the 1970s, things really began to change. And the Lakewood suburban dream began opening up to people of color who broke the racial barrier and began arriving in growing numbers in the wake of federal housing laws, such as the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Even with all the limitations of that act, it did have the effect of beginning to break down the racial barrier around many, many white suburbs. This propelled Lakewood to becoming one of LA County's most racially balanced towns. And in fact, that was happening in a lot of suburbs in that southeastern part of LA. These were suburbs mostly built after World War II in a similar way that Lakewood was built. And what I found in my data analysis is that these southeastern suburbs actually became ground zero of multiracial suburbia in LA. And I think in part too, because of the affordability of homes, that really was a way for home seekers of all ethnic race backgrounds to be able to afford their way into these communities. The Blacks and Latinos and Asians who moved into Lakewood also sought a safe community where they could own a home and raise their children. And their experiences varied widely, from social acceptance to some level of racism and hostility. So I followed the story of several families through this process, but I want to talk to you about the Chase family, just to share a little snapshot of their experience in Lakewood. From the, I'm sorry. The dad, Lewis Chase, was born in Barbados in 1943 into humble circumstances. He was raised by his grandmother, and from a young age, he had deep ties to the Methodist Church. At 14, he quit school because of poverty, as he put it, and he went to work. And then he moved to London as a teen, where he first worked in textiles and then transitioned into community organizing and social justice activism. He ended up earning a degree in Oxford, where he studied Pan-African movements and where he met his future wife, Marion, who was a nursing student at Coventry University, who hailed from Jamaica. In 1980, the couple immigrated to the US and they landed in Lakewood, where they bought a home and started a family. They were the only Black family on their block. And at that time, Lakewood's Black population was just 2%. Lewis didn't recall resistance when they moved in, but he did remember experiencing prejudice now and then. So, for example, he told me about being racially profiled by the Lakewood sheriffs, who would pull him over for without reason, or how the family was often tailed by security guards on their trips to the Lakewood Center Mall. And yet, Lakewood also showed a warmer side. Lewis began attending Lakewood United Methodist Church, which was a conservative, all-white congregation. And pretty quickly, church members there reached out to him, and he started going regularly. And this truly changed his life. The pastor there encouraged him to pursue the ministry, and he ended up attending Claremont School of Theology. And he shared stories with me about how he used to sit on his porch studying theology with his classmates and bouncing his daughter Cassandra on his knee on their front porch. Lewis ultimately became a Methodist minister, and he got deeply involved in church-based social activism in LA, working with people like James Lawson, although in churches that were not in Lakewood. The Chases had two daughters, Cassandra and Chandra, who were both born in Lakewood, making them true original kids of Lakewood. These girls had a very different childhood experience in Lakewood than the white children who came before them. So instead of freely roaming the streets under the eye of friendly neighbors, they led a more sheltered existence, sheltered by their parents who didn't fully trust the community and sought to protect their girls from racism or harm. I mean, I sort of see this as a type of helicopter parenting meant to protect their Black daughters in a white suburban world. In my research and my oral history interviews, I did find that Latinos, Black Americans, and Asian Americans often did encounter racial hostility in Lakewood in one form or the other. One factor that I believe played an indirect role here was Proposition 13. That was the well-known ballot measure passed in California in 1978 that reduced property taxes, but in the process also slashed funding for many social and public services, including resources for human relations work in LA County. Human relations referring to the work of sort of easing the process of racial integration. So right at the very moment that LA's suburbs were about to transition racially, and we're on the cusp of this, Prop 13 passed and it slashed that funding. What that meant was that a lot of suburbs had to figure this out on their own. And quite truthfully, a lot of them did it kind of on autopilot without really thinking in a human relations mindset. That was definitely true of Lakewood. So without having much guidance, Lakewood ended up having a pretty checkered pretty checkered record on race relations from the individual to the municipal level. And I document this in some detail in my book, from the existence of a KKK clavern in Lakewood in the early 1980s to heated clashes at the high school at Lakewood High, to the racially motivated eviction of a number of middle-class Black American families from an apartment complex. All of these I saw as part of a kind of challenge that Lakewood was facing in dealing with race. And Lakewood often couched it as part of a broader malaise that was striking the community. So that by the 80s and 90s, many whites in Lakewood believed it was experiencing its own suburban crisis. This reflected white fears gripping suburbs nationwide and growing concerns about things like rising crime, gangs, drugs, child safety, and as well as economic dislocation that was being fueled by inflation and defense cuts that were threatening jobs. The whole framework of the suburban ideal and suburban dream was becoming undercut, especially at this point. And yet, more often than not, local whites in Lakewood blamed its own suburban crisis on the town's newer diverse residents. And this was often typical in white suburbs that were transitioning racially. This blaming often had little basis in reality and really, I think, revealed a reluctance of white residents to recognize that their new neighbors harbored the same dreams and aspirations as that they did. I think crime was a great example of this misperception. It was a hot button issue locally and was often blamed on people of color in the area. It's true that crime had risen, but if you kind of juxtapose crime rates in Lakewood with the changes in ethno-racial composition of the community, I argued that there was no causal link to be made, because Lakewood's per capita crime rate peaks in 1990 when whites were 72% of the population, and then begins to go down as racial diversity goes up. I think if anything, Lakewood's residents of color were more of a stabilizing influence on public safety. And yet, this tense social climate sparked a shift in community culture from neighborhood trust to a new concern with public safety and law enforcement. And I call this the period of the surveillance suburb. If in the post-war years, moms were the eyes on the street, during Lakewood's, after 1970, safety would come through policing rather than neighbors. And so Lakewood really comes to embrace this sort of culture of public safety and law enforcement law enforcement and embraced it in a number of ways. I go into this in some detail in the book. I'll mention a few key points. One is they pioneered the use of police helicopters in the West. Another is they formed over 29 local programs to fight crime, working with the sheriff's department, including Neighborhood Watch. Lakewood ended up having more Neighborhood Watch groups than any other community in Southern California. And I found that this really, Neighborhood Watch came to serve crucial community building functions. I think the most vivid example of that was that it became the welcome wagon for Lakewood. So when somebody moved in, they'd get a knock at the door from a Neighborhood Watch block captain who'd give them some useful phone numbers, welcome them, maybe bring them a plate of cookies. A lot of Neighborhood Watch groups also held block parties and barbecues and this kind of thing. But I argue in the book that this culture of see something, say something really provided, it was sort of a tenuous basis of neighborhood cohesion, because while it could foster feelings of community stewardship and caretaking on the one hand, it could also invite suspicion and punitive tactics and accusations on the other. And on top of that, you add the LA Sheriff's Department, checkered record on race, and it created a fraught kind of situation. A very few Black Americans got involved as Neighborhood Watch block captains. And what I found that seemed really significant is that those folks, they tended to put their own stamp on the group, emphasizing mutual caregiving and trust, while at the same time remaining deeply skeptical about the Lakewood Sheriff's Department. So just to sum up, I know I'm almost out of time. The Lakewood story, I think, really suggests the challenges and opportunities of life in the new suburbia. Black residents of Lakewood described often to me how they loved Lakewood and they were so happy to be living there, but even with some caveats. 2020 was a real turning point for the community in many ways. It was the summer of George Floyd and BLM. It churned up a lot of protests as well as racist backlash. Lakewood had a crime awareness page on Facebook, which was sort of a social media version of Neighborhood Watch. And that platform became a place where many racist attitudes were posted, really deeply unsettling residents of color. In the wake of that, Lakewood held a series of virtual town hall meetings on race, where stories of racism and discrimination came pouring out. It was really confronting racism for the first time in its history. And then it finally formed a human relations group to keep that dialogue going. And finally, in 2022, there was a true turning point when Cassandra Chase was elected to the city council. It was the first time in Lakewood's over, 70-year history that a Black American was elected to the city council. As quite significantly, I think she brought a more progressive vision to the suburb based on a goal of participatory democracy for all of Lakewood's residents. Cassandra Chase, who was born and bred in Lakewood, I think is very much the face of the new suburbia. And I think her rise to power in this iconic suburb really shows a pivot towards social and political pluralism. She laid claim to her hometown. To her, as she put it, Lakewood always felt like home. And just like many other new suburbanites, I think she's really helping to rewrite the suburban story. Thank you.
Wow, that was great, Becky. Lots in there. I find myself with my brain spinning about all the ways in which I want to use this in classes, both for undergrads and graduate students and practitioners. But I do have some questions for you. I have some questions about the substance of what you were saying, but before I do that, I want to ask you a question about your methodology. It seems like what you shared with us was started with a lot of quantitative data and ended with a lot of interview-based qualitative data. So I think that's great. it's too rare that we see the mixed method approach from historians. And I'm wondering in this era of the ease of sharing data, if you're planning on sharing the interviews, if you're planning on sharing the data set, what's your, can you tell us more about the method and tell us more about your plans?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, whenever I start a study like this, I always want to look at that data or just to have a kind of empirical base of understanding of what is going on. I knew Suburbia was diversifying, but until I crunched those numbers, I just had no clue about what that really looked like. So the very first thing I did when I started working on this book, I got a grant. I hired a team of students to help me compile a pretty large data set on LA County from 1950 to 2010. We collected 53 variables on all 86 municipalities of Los Angeles County. So it's a big data set. And, I was picking like things I was very interested in to try to tell this story, things like race, ethnicity, class markers, education levels, median family income, median housing things, housing data, home ownership. That's where all of those tables and graphs that I shared came out of. I'm excited to be working on what happened with that data. We're still actually working on it. I got an NEH grant, a digital humanities grant, and I'm working with a team at the USC Digital Library to make all of this publicly accessible. It's going to be it'll be not behind paywalls, but just open access. So hopefully it could be a good teaching tool and be used by, I imagine, people in LA, but beyond as well, just to really be tracking a lot of these patterns. I also did about, I think, over 60 oral histories and interviews for the book. That was a lot of work. And it really, I learned so much from those interviews. They often told me things I didn't know about, about what was happening in their communities. I was especially trying to gain the perspective of residents of color because their voices are often not in the archival records, and just to be able to have some understanding of what their experience was like living through these changes. In terms of those being public, that's something I'm hoping to work on. I have to get kind of permission from everybody to do that. That's still a thing in progress.
Well, I hope you're able to do that because that seems like that's going to be one of the very useful outcomes of this, aside from the content of the way you've written it. The first question on the substance that I want to ask you about is about this, the local suburban politics and the way they changed and didn't change. So it was interesting early on, you mentioned that the sort of class-based NIMBYism continues even as the demographics change. And so I wanted to ask you, this is a multi-part question. The policies perhaps continue to be NIMBY-ish, but does the rhetoric change once it's a demographically diverse group of people saying keep out? It seemed like that those kinds of exclusionary zonings, everybody used to understand that was coded racism.
Yeah.
So if it's not racism, how are, it's, is it expressed in a different way? That's one about the change in the local politics. A second in the change of the local politics is that it seems like there's a mismatch. If Cassandra is the first and really noteworthy, and yet this community had been diverse for a while and had diversified earlier. So it seems like there's still very uneven either participation or representation in politics that seem to be still white dominated. So I wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned policing and law and order and the whole neighborhood watch. We all know that that's a scary thing when maintenance of law and order is I don't know which is scarier, letting it be the neighborhood watch or letting it be the LA County Police. Neither one seems like we need to fix both of those approaches. But the piece that you didn't mention after the exclusionary zoning and the policing was schooling and the way people talk about the schools, because that seemed to be also a central feature of the embedded white racism in suburbs. So that's kind of a multi-part question about the change in the local suburban politics. I've got other questions too, but let's let you answer those first.
Yeah, those are great questions, Owen. Thank you. And I deal with all of this in the book in some detail. Regarding the NIMBY discourse and how that does it change as these communities are diversifying. It sort of plays out differently. I found it playing out differently in different suburbs. So in San Marino, for example, which was a wealthy white plus Chinese American suburb, they practiced NIMBYism for sure. And interestingly, what they wanted to keep out were ethnic looking landscapes, including Chinese American Asian landscapes. They didn't want San Marino to look like an ethnoburb. That they could have that in Monterey Park and Alhambra a couple miles away. And so you have this strange kind of situation where there's a kind of consensus among whites and Asian Americans in that suburb that they wanted to keep Anglo-American landscapes intact and not have those influences, which for a variety of reasons, which I kind of get into in some detail. The discourse, interestingly, in that particular, it's a very wealthy elite community. There wasn't a lot of discourse around it. When San Marino passes one of the strictest measures prohibiting Chinese language characters and signage in the late 80s, it was very much a backlash against the influx of Chinese Americans to the community. There was like no discussion of it in the newspapers. It just went under the radar. I think that was the white power structure doing that at the time. But even over the years, as Chinese Americans got onto the design review committee and had a voice in that, amongst some of the people I interviewed, they supported all of that. Like they just felt like that was a good way for them to maintain their property values. They believed that a kind of that older traditional Euro-American architecture was partly a way to protect property values. So just weirdly, like the discourse was kind of non-existent in that community. Take another extreme, Southgate, which was a working class white Latino and then nearly all Latino suburb. They also had some conflict around having ethnic imprints on the landscape, especially in the 80s and 90s. There was a debate, for example, around, there was a Latino council member who wanted to pass a measure prohibiting bright paint colors in the community. And because he felt that would look too Latino. And so there was a lot of racialized discussion around that. And that was a little bit of a NIMBY kind of debate in and of itself. I feel like I'm going too slow on that one. And then you asked about the uneven political representation. For sure, I think Lakewood has been gradual in making that change. It's very that the notion of diverse political leadership has varied. And I think some of the Latino suburbs of Southeast LA, they definitely had earlier Latino representation. I think in part because those communities flipped demographically more extremely. So I think they were able to gain in leadership. But that's a great question. And I'm not sure. I didn't really do broad research to kind of crunch numbers on what that representation looked like in a broad way. If it's more of anecdotal from my case studies. Okay, and then you asked me about policing. Sorry, what was that question exactly?
It wasn't necessarily a question about policing, because I don't expect you to answer which is scarier, the neighborhood watch or the.
Oh, yeah.
You don't
Yeah,
have to.
they can both be kind of scary, I think.
Yes.
I mean, I interviewed people in Lakewood. I was really interested in getting the perspective of residents of color, especially Black Americans in Lakewood, about Neighborhood Watch and policing. And like, did you join Neighborhood Watch? What did you think of Neighborhood Watch? And there was some reluctance of them to talk about it. I talked to two people kind of off the record. I had to use pseudonyms for them. And I think for them, they did feel like they could take that group and co-opt it to more benign community building ends. And I think that's a great example of how they were changing the suburbs instead of the suburbs changing them. So they tried to use that group to build trust amongst their neighbors without having the sheriffs involved at all, because they didn't really trust the sheriffs. So they sort of grabbed it as a basis of community on their own terms.
That's a great answer. It's as though if Andrew Sandoval Strauss made the argument with his book, Barrio America, How Latinos Saved the City, you're sort of saying diversity maybe has saved the suburbs, but you're not quite sure yet.
It's mixed because I think in some areas we see it happening, and there have been these moments, these sort of hopeful moments of interracial cooperation and community building. I'm actually going to be writing an article about that just to kind of focus on the positive. I did find quite a bit of evidence in the other direction of that NIMBYism, of exclusion, of not wanting affordable housing, or, by suburbanites of color, the usual kind of anti, the defensive politics of suburbia being practiced by these residents, these diverse residents, that we definitely, there's tons of evidence of that, I think, in a lot of communities in LA. And the book really tells a lot of those stories.
Well, you've certainly done a great job of making us all realize that this is a book that is going to have a lasting impact. I see Carol has unmuted herself, and it's 7:01, so I'm thinking that it's time for Carol to wrap things up for us.
Well, I popped onto the screen in order to, yes, thank the both of you for such a strong and intelligent and sensitive discussion of these issues. It's the kind of subject that we, with just a methodology that you described, and a series of purpose set in the historical framework that is the way that I think we all aspire to do history and to live lives that have that kind of level of awareness. So thank you so much, Becky, and also Owen, for bringing this conversation together. I will mention that our next book talk, because these are a series where we do a monthly focus by an author. And I'm here in the gallery in a changing installation of our new exhibition, which is called Tall Timber, the Future of Cities in Wood, that looks at the application of the industrialized engineered wood of mass timber to building an urban landscape that is attuned to the climate crisis, one of the other compelling issues of our moment. So next time on March 5th, we have Lindsay Wickstrom and a book called Designing the Forest, which also is a future for building with timber. And then we return to New York for those fans locally in study of the architecture of Fifth Avenue. We have actually two focuses on Fifth Avenue with for women's history on the department stores, and then another look at very nearby Fifth Avenue on Central Park South. So we'll be returning to a strong architectural focus after our diversion, our walk into the forest, and to bring the connections to wood and cities and suburbs that were built in the tradition of stick-built balloon frame that shaped the American landscape. These are all questions of urbanism and suburbanism that we hope we can bring to our audience through intelligent conversations like tonight. So Becky and Owen, thanks so much for being here tonight to create that conversation, and come back. Thank you everybody for being with us, and see you next time.
Thanks for having such a great book series, Carol. It's great to
Our pleasure.
Thank you, Carol and Owen.
To introduce our speaker, Becky Nicolaides, who also studied in New York at Columbia, as we three all did, all part of the cohort of Ken Jackson students who became inflamed with the passion for urban history. Owen, in many ways, is the perfect person to introduce Becky and then to be the discussants. He taught at Columbia and Barnard. He is now moved over to Hunter, where he directs the urban studies program there. He is a scholar of both cities and suburbs, the expanding landscape of America, historically. In the book that he did, 20th Century Sprawl, Highways and Remaking the Urban Landscape. So those of you who came in January know that we had a talk also on the same city subject as tonight, on Los Angeles. And tonight's talk follows on a talk that happened last month by James Sanders and also colleagues of his from the architectural firm Woods Bagot, who put together a book also on LA with a contemporary and future focus called Renewing the Dream. And I'm showing you the cover of that book so that you know you can go back after tonight and look on our website or look on our YouTube channel and see the archived video of that talk. So the question is, why does the Skyscraper Museum focus on Los Angeles in two sessions? Well, city and suburban, urban and suburban are the American yin and yang of our contemporary society. We're all interested in all things that have to do with urbanization and the future of the city. And certainly the new suburbia has as its counterpart the city in the center. If not skyscrapers, certainly a changing landscape.